So greetings and thanks for joining us to explore, as promised in our title, the critical role of messaging in implementing an effective assessment process. I'm Pat Hutchings, and I'm a senior scholar with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. Joining me, or really, I'm joining them, are Shauna Freeman-Lane and Erin Malick, both from Highline College here. Yes, we have a waving going on. Highline College here in Washington State, where all three of us live. I had the privilege to work with them and a group of their colleagues for an intensive and, of course, virtual week of assessment planning last summer, and this session really came out of that experience. So our aim today is to look not just at the doing of assessment, but how assessment is talked about, how it's framed and understood, and how the work is represented to various audiences. That's an important issue because how it's talked about and understood has everything to do with whether it will be a useful process that actually improves the learning and success of all students. So with that, I'll turn things to Shauna.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you to everyone who is joining this session today. My name is Shauna Freeman-Lane. I am a business faculty member at Highline College and the assessment committee chair. And upon entering the Zoom room, we're posed 3 questions in a poll. So those questions are meant to just allow us to know a little bit more about who is joining us today. So I'd like to share these results. Hopefully everyone can see those. Awesome. And so based on this, it's really great to see that a number of you are engaging in this type of change on your campuses, and that messaging is important based on, there's good messaging and there's maybe not so great messaging. So hopefully you'll get something helpful out of this session. We do want to sort of give a disclaimer that while we are going to share quite a bit of what we have done, we are not necessarily experts on communication or messaging, but we do feel that our experience has provided us with some really helpful strategies and principles to support keeping all stakeholders engaged and knowledgeable in these types of processes. Okay. All right, so our agenda for today. We will start with discussing a little bit about our journey at Highline College in terms of assessment. We'll then have Pat share with you a really tremendous set of principles that really guided our way for communicating our assessment changes. We'll then show you some examples and really talk about those examples of how communication and messaging really helped our journey. And then we'll have some time for reflection, questions, takeaways that you might have.
Thank you, Shauna, and hello, everyone. My name is Erin Malick. I'm a chemistry instructor at Highline College and the vice chair of our faculty-led assessment committee. So a little background about our school as we lead into the agenda for today. Highline is a community college located just south of Seattle. Our student body is one of the most diverse in the nation, with over 75% of our students being students of color. We offer a variety of certificates as well as transfer and workforce associate's degrees and a handful of Bachelor of Applied Science degrees as well.
Thank you, Erin. And so I'd just like to talk a little bit about our journey through assessment at our college, and it may actually look familiar to a number of your institutions. Focus on assessment at Highline really began in the mid to late 2000s, which we tend to think of as our era 1, where like a lot of other institutions, accrediting bodies began encouraging more valid focus on student learning outcomes, primarily at the course level. And so for about a period of 5 years, Highline really focused on developing and vetting very robust course level outcomes. Over time, that transitioned us into what we now see as our Era 2, which saw the development and implementation of an internal online assessment submission system. This allowed faculty to document their course level assessments in an accountable, convenient, and transparent way. However, as the higher education landscape started to change and shift more towards higher levels of assessment, so did Highline. And so Era 3 was ushered in by the welcoming of our new Vice President of Academic Affairs, who encouraged and really supported shifting our assessment endeavors to college level outcome assessment, which we call core competency assessment.
So that gives you a quick sense of what Highline has been doing, a lot in a few years here. And as you'll see, they've been thoughtful not only about what to do, but how to talk about it, as Shauna and Aaron are going to tell you about very shortly. What I'd like to do now is to provide a kind of advance organizer for their further comments by walking quickly through this set of principles for effective communication about assessment, which come in part from my own experience with lots of campuses over many years, but more immediately from Highline's experience and our preparations for this session. So the first principle really is the first principle, pointing to the need for a persistent focus on improving the success of all students. As many of you know all too well, assessment is complicated and sometimes fraught. It can feel like a mandate from on high, not a particularly appealing proposition for most of us. And there can be missteps and backing up, but also important rethinking. Through it all, one message needs to be front and center. It's about improving the educational experience of all students. Now, of course, just saying this is not enough. It has to be true. But saying it, keeping it right in front of people at every opportunity, really matters as well. The second principle, iteration and refinement, is a kind of elaboration of the first. Yes, keep that first big message in front of people, but recognize as well that as the work of assessment unfolds, as the campus figures out its path forward, new ways to talk about it are bound to emerge. And that's a good thing. It's also complicated because not everyone is going to talk about it in the same way. The idea here then is to make sure that the ways, that's plural, assessment is talked about evolve to reflect new ideas, refined plans, clarifications, and especially new and different voices in ways that encourage collective ownership. Which brings me to my next item, inclusivity. There are many audiences for assessment: faculty, administrators. There are some of both of those in the audience: student affairs professionals, students themselves, accreditors, alums, policymakers, and you can probably continue the list. Effective messaging and communication means thinking about the messages appropriate to these sometimes quite different audiences. Those messages need to reflect the different perspectives, experiences, and goals of those groups, who are not, finally, just audiences after all, but critical partners in improvement. And so we come to documentation and transparency. And though these could be separate items, we've paired them to say that one of the things that's really plagued assessment through the years is a failure to communicate, to document in transparent ways what has been accomplished and what difference it makes. Often this challenge is framed in terms of how a campus represents its contributions to student learning to outside audiences. And okay, that's especially tricky, but equally important is how assessment is talked about on and with the campus. This means being honest, keeping everyone in the loop, sharing challenges, and being very mindful about sharing accomplishments. This last point is especially critical in engaging faculty by showing how assessment can help them and their students in the everyday work of teaching and learning. Which brings us back to that big picture, a persistent focus on the success of all students, but with the added emphasis here on making sure that assessment is seen not as a thing unto itself, a kind of add-on, a train on its own track, but as a contributor, an integral piece, contributing to other agendas that serve student success: work on general education, a stronger first-year experience, more active teaching approaches, and the way the institution makes decisions. Okay, so principles only go so far. They can be useful heuristics and organizers, and we hope that's true here, but they tend to live at 30,000 feet. And so let me now turn this back to Shauna and Aaron to give a sense of some of the ways these principles have played out on the ground in their work.
Thanks, Pat. So as Pat just said, these principles only go so far. So Shauna and I are going to share how Highline has incorporated these ideas that Pat just introduced to our own assessment process and highlight the messaging we've used to communicate our work and recruit collaborators. So first, we developed and then shared a set of what we call lead principles to help guide our work and to help stakeholders understand why we are assessing in the first place. So we said assessment at Highline is learning-centered and equity-focused. It aligns course outcomes with our core competencies, and it's part of our development as faculty members. And then as Shauna mentioned earlier, in our previous era, we developed a robust course outcomes assessment process, and now we're shifting our assessment focus to exit outcomes, or what we refer to as core competencies. So after working with various stakeholders to rewrite those core competencies, we started developing a process to systematically assess them using the AAC&U value rubrics. So to do that, we had to sell this process and its importance to our faculty colleagues. And as that little image in the top right corner of your screen says, to get our buy-in from our colleagues and start this process, we had to do that all virtually. So with the help of our awesome colleague in communication studies, Lisa Voso, we developed a consistent message that is centered on our student success. We've repeated this message at faculty meetings, professional development workshops, at our annual assessment retreat, and I'll just read you part of that message so you can get a sense of how we focus and center our work on student success. So we have in our minds, as a Highline community, a concept of what student success is. And we can't forget that student success includes how they look once we set them free into their careers of choice. Part of that success is when our students find jobs that they are passionate about, happy in, and ones where they are able to live their version of the American dream. One thing that we used to frame our discussion around core competencies was external data. So an example of what we looked at is on your screen from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. It shows what competencies employers are looking for, where 1 is not essential and 5 is absolutely essential. The top one is critical thinking, which in the STEM fields must include quantitative reasoning. Teamwork and professionalism show that employers want their team members to take responsibility for their work community and the people that they serve. Of course, they want their employees to have strong oral and written communication skills. Digital technology means that our students need to be literate in interpreting and analyzing information. And in the top 8 across the board, you finally have employers talking about globalism and multiculturalism, something that we here at Highline have been emphasizing for a while. These competencies are what employers are looking for, and we owe it to our students to not only say we are helping develop these skills, but to prove it.
Thank you, Aaron. And that takes us to the second principle, which is iteration and refinement and innovation. And it's good to place some context because Aaron did mention that much of this work did take place obviously during this pandemic, but prior to the pandemic is when we really started these endeavors. And so we were lucky in some ways to have focused a lot of our attention on trying to educate ourselves on best practices for college level assessment. So we attended a lot of conferences and seminars and workshops in person, building and sharing the process along the way with our stakeholders. In fact, after nearly every conference or training, we went back to our team or our immediate stakeholders and updated them on the options or many directions that we could take our college level assessment process. But as the pandemic began and started to change our way of life, we knew we had to continue building on what we had started. So in winter and spring of 2020, we saw continued revision and rethinking of how we would go about this process, partially because of the pandemic, but also because we continued to learn more about the processes. And that culminated in our attending the virtual offering of the Washington Center's Summer Institute for Improving Undergraduate Education, which is where we had the honor of meeting Pat. And an analogy that I've liked to use over time about this process, this iteration, this refinement is, by the time we had attended the Summer Institute, much of our assessment plane, its exterior had already been built right there on the tarmac. What this sort of innovative principle had allowed us to do was take the time to insert the right engine at the right time. And so the Summer Institute was really the right engine, and many of those parts had already been built for the plane and had already been tested before we even got to the Summer Institute. So through messaging, folks really were able to, one, know that the plane was being built because it was right there in front of them. They saw it, they heard it, but they also knew that very soon our assessment plane was going to fly.
So thanks, Shauna. So as we started planning and implementing our core competency assessment process, we emphasized Pat's third principle of inclusivity. We sought out a diverse group of faculty and students to pilot this project, and we were purposeful in communicating our plan and our processes with other committees, with student services, and with our academic affairs leadership, who has been instrumental in supporting this work. So as you can see from this little Google poll, we had representation from both full-time and part-time faculty. We had faculty with interest in assessing all 6 of our core competencies. So we had a diverse group of disciplines represented as well. And what you don't see on this slide is we also had a diverse group of students divided among these 6 core competencies who have participated and are participating in this pilot process of core competency assessment. And they've made us make sure that our work stays centered on student success.
Thanks, Aaron. And as we mentioned earlier about Era 2, Highline had placed a lot of focus on documenting at the course level for assessment. However, that didn't necessarily translate to other areas of our assessment endeavors. For example, we didn't have a lot of documentation that was public to all of our stakeholders, such as students and staff and community members. And we didn't have documentation of how we went about doing things or the organization of our committee. So as a result, we developed a new website that improved the layout to make it maybe more palatable for folks who were non-Highline stakeholders. And we developed an assessment plan inspired by the work of a neighboring institution, Whatcom Community College. And to support all of these changes, we also used our quarterly newsletters, which had been introduced in Era 2, but to greater effect to really engage and remind faculty of all the changes that were going on.
So finally, we have emphasized that assessment is part of the larger goals of our institution, getting to Pat's 5th principle here. As we have developed our version of guided pathways at Highline, it's been immensely beneficial to collaborate and share with faculty and staff across campus on a variety of projects under the umbrella of guided pathways. It's also allowed us to communicate to our colleagues that the assessment work we are doing is part of that other big thing our campus is focused on. We're not just adding another task to their to-do list, but it's all part of the work we're already doing to improve student success. Also really important to highlight here that our administration gave this college level assessment work a platform, not just in its connection to guided pathways, but also in allowing the assessment committee to inform and engage with faculty at nearly every faculty meeting. They've encouraged cross-communication with other communities, and they've allowed time for what we call our annual assessment retreat that now occurs during every opening week of the academic year. And a special shout out to our Vice President of Academic Affairs, who has been particularly important in supporting and communicating this work, from doing the big picture, say providing us with the resources and directions to do this work, getting us aligned here with Pat to help us along our journey, to the smaller but no less important work of attending our assessment meetings, giving opening remarks at our workshops and professional developments that we have put on. That supports and just that visibility of her being in the room has helped emphasize the importance of this work to our faculty colleagues and to our institution as a whole. So with a little bit of time left, I'd like to quickly share where we are at in this pilot of core competency assessment that we've developed. So earlier this month, we had our first workshop we entitled Value Rubrics 101, where my awesome colleague, Ellen Bremen, led 36 faculty members 12 students through an introduction to the AAC&U value rubrics. So we looked at the dimensions and the performance levels of the written communication rubric. That's a little screenshot from our meeting on your screen now. And we were able to get into breakout rooms, discuss the framing language, the terminology, and what, say, a phrase like demonstrates an awareness of context means to our individual disciplines. And finally, at the end of that meeting, we had a chance to practice scoring Highline College student work. And then in a few weeks, we're going to have our second workshop where that same group of faculty and students will focus on their designated core competency, and we'll do sort of similar work, making sense of the value rubrics that are more appropriate for their discipline. Finally, in the spring, our third workshop will be the first time our school has done an assignment charrette, which is borrowed from NILOA's collaborative assignment design process. And here, faculty and students will work together to develop and refine assignments to be used with these value rubrics. So the goal here is to be scoring our own student work by the end of this academic year, so we can tabulate and disaggregate some data, begin to share our results with our institutional and our community stakeholders. And I really want to highlight one more time that students are part of this entire project. They are equal contributors in each of these workshops, providing us with their perspective, their understanding of these rubrics, and really the goal is for them to help us as faculty write aligned and transparent assignments that ensure that students will know what they need to do to show their best work on an assignment that will be assessed using those value rubrics. So that's where we are at this point. We're still sort of learning as we go, but with that, I'll turn it back over to Shauna to wrap it up.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all on behalf of myself, Aaron, and Pat. We really appreciate you joining this session. For the next couple of minutes, we would love to hear and answer any questions you may have or feedback that you'd like to share. So thank you.
And I'm looking at the chat to see if questions show up there. I think you can also raise a hand under participants. Checking there.
I see a question from Cindy Campbell, thanks. So the question in the chat is, how did you determine which students would be involved? That was tricky, I'll say that. So in our guided pathways work groups, one of the guided pathways groups is called Student Voices, and they are a couple of deans at our institution who are sort of leading that group. And so we tasked them with finding students, and we all sort of got a late start finding those students. So it was a bit of a scramble. We did this over winter break to find those students. But they reached out to some people who worked in, say, the tutoring center and to some education related or education major type students who might be interested in this work. And they were purposeful, making sure we had not exactly a perfectly representative sample of our student body, but making sure it did represent the various types of students that we have at Highline.
I'll just jump in and say that the notion of involving students as authentic participants in the work on assessment, which is, after all, the work on learning, has really taken hold nationally. And there are lots of interesting examples. If you want to go to the NILOA website, NILOA, you can find some accounts of how different campuses have done that. So I think Highline has a very good thing going in that regard. I see another question here from Sheila Prabhakar Abraham. I know you mentioned you had initially focused on course level assessment. Is there a reason you chose college level assessment over program level assessment?
So I think I can answer that one, and it's a situation that's possibly unique to Highline, but for our transfer degree, we don't necessarily have program level outcomes. All of our courses, the course level outcomes really just map directly to the college level core competencies. And so for us, we felt that it would be sort of a way to kind of blanket all programs, all courses, all of our degrees by going straight to the core competency level versus sort of focusing on program level. I will mention that our professional, technical, or workforce degrees do have program level outcomes, but they map directly to the college level. So by taking care of the college level, we end up sort of taking care of the program level all at once.
And again, I'll jump in and say that one of the things that strikes me, and it was very clear in Erin's final comments about the assignment charrette, for instance, that in moving to the institution level, you aren't leaving the classroom behind. And I think finding ways to connect those really matters, and communicating about those connections really matter, because it goes back to one of the points on my list, this is Pat, about connecting the work of assessment to the ongoing regular daily work of teachers and students together. So a comment back to Shauna, we have science, math, and nursing, which, and so each department developed their own discipline-specific outcomes. I think that's kind of common.
I would like to add to that, Sheila, that for us, we have a similar situation for our what we would call professional technical for nursing, or our quantitative programs like science and math. And for those, we try to be intentional with the program level outcomes so that they directly related to each one of those core competency college level. So even for nursing students, we say, okay, this is something you need to know that's sort of a very practical workforce-based skill or outcome, but it should map to either quantitative reasoning, or maybe it's a critical thinking skill that they're developing, or community focus, whatever it might be. So we hope to be we hope to make that one-to-one connection for each of the program outcomes.
We have just a minute left, so maybe we're at a good point here to kind of wrap things up. One thing that would have been fun to talk about, and maybe it's a session for next year, is some of the assumptions about assessment that need to be countered with effective messaging and communication. I see some nodding by my co-presenters here. So I don't know if you want 30 seconds on that, Erin or Shauna?
I'll just say it was great having someone from communications help us craft our messaging, because that was definitely part of that longer message that I didn't get a chance to finish, was pushing back on some of those common misconceptions was definitely part of the message we've shared at, say, faculty meetings and stuff like that.
I agree. And I'll just say very briefly, Erin really sort of touched on it perfectly, but having the support of administration makes a world of difference, and support in a way that provides freedom to sort of figure out the process on our own, but then also the guidance when we need it, when we ask for it. All those kind of things are tremendously important for kind of changing folks' perceptions, because we are excited about assessment because we have the support that we really need.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you, everybody. And the slides will be posted. We'll send them off now that they're finished. And you can find them on the conference website. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Shauna and Erin, for including me.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.